Well, hello again sports fans. This is the latest trimming flight of my new Ranger, and I have made quite a few changes since the last flight. If you've seen the previous couple of videos, you'll know that I wasn't very happy with the way the INAV flight modes were operating. The Ranger seemed to be having trouble maintaining a straight course while it was under INAV control, and I eventually realised it was because I had entered quite a bit of left-hand trim into the transmitter. I also thought it lacked a bit of authority in the air on the 3S battery with all the extra FPV gear it was carrying. So I finally followed the advice I'd been getting from a couple of friends and decided to upgrade it to a 4S setup. I upgraded the motor to a hopefully slightly better quality with a lower kV rating, and I purchased a couple of brand spanking new 5200 mAh 4S batteries. I mechanically readjusted all the Ranger's control surfaces to neutral, apart from the rudder where I left just a little touch of left in. And finally I removed all of the trims and expo and dual rates from the transmitter. I also spent a bit of time reading the doco on INAV and watching a few how-to videos I found on YouTube. And as a result, I ended up making quite a few changes to my INAV setup through the INAV configurator. I worked out which flight modes I'd actually need for the style of flying that I do and set them up on the transmitter switches. I reduced the manual mode rates and increased the expo through the INAV configurator. And I discovered a couple of handy little functions called auto trim and auto tune that allow you to trim the model in flight, hopefully. So needless to say, after all these changes, it was with some trepidation that I approached the flight line for the launch. As this was the first launch with the 4S setup, I wasn't quite sure how I should go about it. I opted for full throttle with a fairly flat trajectory, but it only cleared the ground by about half an inch, but half an inch is plenty, isn't it? I should probably mention that the blue tinge in the video is due to me messing around with the colour settings on my Mobius camera, and it does eventually get better for some reason. So I've launched in manual mode, and at this stage of the flight I'm mainly focused on getting up to a safe altitude. It looks like reducing the manual rates in INAV has been a success. It's a lot easier to handle. And the mechanical adjustments I've made to the Ranger's control surfaces also seem to have helped, though there is still a need for a bit of left-hand trim there that I'm feeling. The upgraded power system also seems to be a success. I'm certainly seeing the authority that's been lacking in the 3S system up until now. So at this stage I'm still got eyes on the plane, but even with the trim imbalance I'm finding it's improved enough for me to be quite comfortable flying off the screen, so that's what I do. Switch over and just do a few circuits of the field, getting comfortable with the new responses and checking out the wind direction in order to work out the best straight course to fly when I switch to the auto trim function. So at this point I'm fairly comfortable with how everything's going, and I fly a fair bit out south in anticipation of the auto trim run, when suddenly this happens. I'm struggling to keep it in the air and I've got no idea what's happened. I'm entering aileron commands to counteract the roll, but it doesn't seem to be having any effect. In fact, it seems to be making it worse. Thankfully the elevator still seems to be working, and then just as suddenly as I lost control I seemed to get it back and the aileron seemed to be working correctly once more. I'm pretty spooked by the whole experience though, and I spend a fair bit of time flying around just making sure that the controls are working. I'm thinking that it must have been a glitch in the INAV somehow, and I'm very concerned that it might happen again, so it's some time before I decide to set up for another auto trim run. And when I do finally get enough confidence to flip the switch, I actually flipped the wrong one and put it into auto tune rather than auto trim. At this stage I've got my eyes on the plane trying to make sure I'm flying a straight and level course, and I've only glanced down at the screen to make sure that the tuning function had activated, which it had, but I just didn't notice that it was the tune function rather than the trim function. So in accordance with INAV's auto trim protocol, I leave what I think is the auto trim function activated while I set up for a landing. Once again, in accordance with the protocol, I don't deactivate the function immediately after landing, and it's only when I do go to deactivate it that I notice that I'm in auto tune rather than auto trim. I think disarming the model like this when in auto tune actually discards any new settings that have been gathered during the flight, but I have found the information about this a bit confusing. In either event, it's clear that I didn't actually carry out an auto trim flight as I'd hoped, and I'm going to have to do it again. So I throw the Ranger up again, and in the confusion I've forgotten to turn on the Mobius camera again, so I only have the DVR footage of this section of the flight. So I do a couple of circuits, and it's clear that the trims haven't changed at all, so the auto trim exercise is still worth carrying out. So I set up on a straight run and flick the switch and check the screen to make sure it says auto trim and not auto tune, and bring her around for a landing. I don't have the DVR set up to record audio from the plane, so you'll just have to put up with this little bit of silence. I could sing to you or make airplane noises, but it doesn't last very long. So once again I follow the auto trim protocol and leave it in auto trim mode for a little while before disarming and hopefully saving the new trims. So this is the moment of truth. At least I'm getting plenty of launching practice with the new 4S battery. So the first thing I'm interested in seeing is whether or not the trims have actually been saved, and I'm pretty pleased to see that that actually seems to be the case. The wings are staying pretty level with my hands off the sticks. She is dropping a little, but that's something I can easily fix up at some stage in the future. The real test though is how are the flight modes going to behave now that she's been trimmed. I decided to test cruise mode first, and I'm pretty pleased to see there's no sign of the left-hand circling that I've experienced on the last couple of flights. The Ranger seems happy enough to maintain a constant heading, but responds nicely to both the ailerons and the rudder input. Even the altitude is fairly constant. Switching into 3D cruise also yields the same good results. She's maintaining a nice steady heading and an even steadier altitude, and is responding well to both aileron and rudder inputs. The turns are really quite smooth. I'm quite impressed with how stable she is. I fly around for a while in this mode, and I can see it probably being one of my favourites on some of my long range missions. So I bring it back closer to home and activate loiter mode, which is cruise mode plus position hold mode. And she slips straight into a nice stable loiter pattern with very little variation in altitude. And I just leave it in the loiter pattern for a while and take my eyes off the screen so I can just watch how the Ranger's flying and holding itself in flight. I must admit that I'm pretty pleased with how everything's going at the moment. The Ranger's flying pretty well on 4S, and now that I've taken the time to set the INAV up properly, it's hard to find a fault with that either. So I'm a fairly happy camper when I finally decide it's time to bring it down and have a cup of tea. I did do a quick test of return to home mode early in the flight, and it worked perfectly. I just haven't included it in this video for the sake of keeping it as short as possible. I decided to try a landing in cruise mode rather than manual mode, and that also seemed to go pretty well. So the only shadow that really falls over today's flights was that mysterious loss of control I had early on in the first trimming exercise. At the time I thought it must have been related to some sort of glitch within INAV, but now that I've reviewed the video, I think it's probably more appropriate to describe it as a result of a dispute over airspace. I don't know how many of these big buggers there were or how often they actually hit me, but it certainly accounts for the sudden dramatic changes in attitude of the plane without any control inputs from me.